Madam Speaker, let's be clear about what the state of Afghanistan was like before the West invaded there. We do think the Taliban had some control, particularly over areas in the south, but largely the political structure was such that it was made up of small ethnic tribes. It didn't have any real political structure to it. We don't think the Taliban had complete control over the country. They were burning women at the stake and making things really, really awful. We think they had some level of power, and it was a relatively stable level of power. So we don't think it's nearly as bad. We reject the characterization completely given to us by the negative team today. I'm going to have 2 points of rebuttal before I go on to my substantive. First of all, I want to talk about the difference between human rights and what we're trying to get today in terms of everyone. And secondly, about the difference between outcomes for like Al-Qaeda and Taliban and how that's played out. First of all, what we heard was that we wanted to get fundamental human rights to people, and that was the overarching aim, and that was more important. A couple of problems with this. First of all, there is a trade-off, right? So you can't fight for human rights at the same time necessarily keep the country economically stable, keep it feasible, and actually allow people to be worse, to be better off overall. First of all, we doubt how much better in practice human rights actually are, and I'll get into that more later in my speech. But second of all, we think that what's happening at the moment is that lots of people are dying. We think it's far more than they would have been in any other circumstance, whatever they'd like to say. We think that a lot of the people included in that are women and children. So a lot of people are worse off, and that includes women and children, regardless of whether they're being specifically persecuted. Everyone as a whole is worse off. We think that's what matters more in terms of vast numbers. We think, moreover, there actually still exists a lot of problem for women. So they wanted to say there was lots of incidents with acid throwing on girls so they couldn't go to school. Like, that was last year, twice. And it's actually something that still exists today, and it's been exacerbated when the Taliban sees that they're losing control over their own country and they act out in more violent and more awful ways. We think, moreover, a couple of other things. They said, they simply asserted, they said, oh yeah, women can be politicians now, it's really great for them. I do not think that is the case at all, if not in law, then simply in practice. So we do not see female politicians, we do not see powerful women in those societies. And we don't think they're good at all. Like, the idea that women can go to hospital, we think it is particularly problematic to try and even have a functioning hospital at all when your society is not functioning, it's not stable, and you have constant fighting within that community. We think things are worse off for everyone, particularly women and children within that group. Secondly, we heard a couple of things about what happened for the Taliban and for Al-Qaeda. And what we heard was that the reason that things like the Taliban were so strong was because they could work off anti-Western sentiment, and that was a problem. I think, that they caused anti-Western sentiment, and when you remove the Taliban, you would get rid of all that anti-Western sentiment. I think that's exactly the wrong way around. The reason they're able to have so much power is because they work off the anti-Western sentiment. They recruit on the anti-Western sentiment. I'll talk more about that in substantive. And we think that you make things far worse when you have a very practical reason of why you hate the West, and that they are in your country fighting and killing your people. That's a very practical way to try and get people to hate them. Moreover, we also heard that it's actually really good that we got rid of Al-Qaeda because they've moved elsewhere. We think you simply displace the problem, and as Ronald told you in detail, this actually made things far worse because it's harder to attack them. We heard that drones were going there and breaking up groups. What drones are actually doing is making it harder for people because it makes it more likely that you're going to hate the West. It makes it easier for them to garner support. On Pakistan, we thought it was an absolute problem they were in Pakistan. They simply said, well, Pakistan's fine because they're an ally. Like, they're an ally, but there are also a lot of problems with Pakistan that's widely acknowledged, and we think that's why the relationship with them is so tense. So we see that, like, the ISS is largely sympathetic to terrorist groups. We're seeing that they're most likely have actually sheltered terrorist groups. We saw that with Osama bin Laden. We saw and found and evidence that they'd actually hidden them. We think it is the worst place possible to drive Al-Qaeda out of Afghanistan, where at least you had some level of accessibility in terms of trying to fight that, rather than driving it somewhere where you're going to have them sheltered and done in that way. We thought that was particularly problematic. So I'm going to have a couple of points of substantive in today's debate. First of all, I want to talk about the practical outcomes of anti-Western sentiment and how that figures out in a couple of ways. And secondly, about how this has hampered the long-term development of Afghanistan and made that far worse and irrevocably worse than it would have been if it had been left alone. So firstly, about anti-Western sentiment, because what we think we can say pretty clearly is that having the West in your country, as I said, killing your people, a very visible presence, makes it very easy for groups like the Taliban to point to you and say, see them, they're the reason that things are bad for you. They're the reason you don't have food. They're the reason that people are dying in your country, and they're the reason that things are just generally crap for you. We think that's problematic because it allows them to do a couple of things. Firstly, it allows them to work off that anti-Western sentiment. So whereas the Taliban may have been, like, in some cases, it had extreme elements to it, those were out branches of it. So it didn't allow those elements to gain main power in those places. We think the Taliban was just generally a lot of different opinions. We think that you allow these extremist parts of the Taliban to garner more traction when they actually have something to go off, when they can say we can point practically to something that supports our views rather than the more moderate elements from doing anything. We just think that's problematic because it greatly increases their capacity to increase their support base. It drags people away from more moderate things who wouldn't necessarily have joined the Taliban or supported the Taliban because they simply wouldn't have seen reason to. We think that vastly increases and actually changes things. Ronald told you why this was and why anti-Western sentiment grew far worse under the system, or why that was particularly problematic when you're actually trying to win the hearts and minds of people. We reject this idea that hearts and minds aren't something that important at all, because we think that is actually the number one way in which you generate change in a country, particularly countries such as Afghanistan, where you're trying to generate widespread change across the community. We think, moreover, because of that, we think it actually leads to worse outcomes in terms of what they can do. Firstly, we think it gives a platform on which groups like the Taliban can rise. We think it's particularly problematic. We think it also entrenches that within that society, and we think it's far more likely to lead to practical outcomes in terms of what they're able to do in that. Secondly, in terms of other things and what this has done for long-term development of that country, we think this has harmed this in a number of ways. First of all, as Ronald flagged, this has been ravaged the country economically. We think there is no chance whatsoever of any level of development in Afghanistan for a long time. This is problematic for the single fact of, like, when you have people in your country, when you aren't able to actually generate any new industries, when you have them being destroyed all the time, there is absolutely no way you can function properly as a functioning economy in any particular way. We think this is particularly problematic not only because of the real impacts of that now, but because when the West leaves, that means that there is no chance whatsoever for there to be growth in the future, because you've defined this country as a relatively failed state. You don't think there's really anything going there, and there hasn't been any real substantial change that points it's going to change in the future. It means people are less likely to go and want to invest there. There is less likely that people are going to actually want to support that at all. So it is undoubtedly in a worse economic position than it would have been 10 years ago, not only because of the problems that you've done with it, but because you've made it impossible for them to ever get out of that situation in the future, because there is no means for them to do so. We think that you've done this irrevocably, and there's absolutely no way to step them out of it, and there's no chance of recovery. And just lastly, on the other things that were pertaining to what the other harms of this were. And that was basically in terms of how this actually undermined other principles of what we heard from, which was flagged on basically what we think this has done for the West. Because we think this has done a couple of things, push them into doing things like torture. So we've seen other things where the US has actually undermined its principles in engaging in torture. We think it has very practical harms, obviously for the people who are being tortured, but also in terms of what it does for the West and the people who have to do that. We think that loses less faith in the West to actually prosecute and be like the global guy who takes care of everyone, because people see they don't like the methods that they're doing. We think that's problematic because it means you're less likely to gain traction for more prosecutions and more actual trying to fight the war on terror. We think that's problematic because that's something that's particularly important to try and continue doing. We think the war in Afghanistan makes this far worse, because when you see the elements that have gone into it, you are less likely to support that and less likely to do that. That's why the hearts and minds have been lost throughout that. And we thought that was something that was particularly important when you needed to have a level of support to actually continue any kind of invasion. We think that, practically speaking, people shouldn't end up being treated in particular ways. And we think that in terms on the basis of outcomes for human rights, they wanted to talk about that as one of their main things. This was a clear breach of it. It was particularly problematic and likely to occur when you had these kind of invasions and these kind of policies going ahead. Madam Speaker, we think that Afghanistan is always going to be problematic, but we think it would have been far better if it hadn't had the West intervene and make things far worse. We think it has done more harm than good, and the good that's been done is not good enough. For that reason, we are proud to propose.